Brad Banks was never supposed to happen. In fact, heading into the 2002 season, he wasn't even supposed to start. He had never opened a college season as a quarterback, had bounced from UCF to junior college, and wasn't listed on any preseason Heisman watch list. And yet, by the time the year ended, Banks wasn't just winning games, he was winning arguments. He became the nation's top-rated passer, led Iowa to one of the best seasons in school history, captured the Davey O'Brien Award as college football's best quarterback, and finished as the runner-up for the Heisman Trophy. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when efficiency, decision-making, and composure collide at exactly the right moment. Banks didn't overwhelm defenses with volume, he dismantled them with precision. Touchdowns without turnovers, big plays without panic, road wins without excuses. And when the pressure spiked, Penn State, Purdue, late drives, fourth downs, he didn't flinch. Coaches praised his poise. Teammates followed his calm. Media members voted him College Player of the Year. Everything the NFL claims to value was right there on tape, in the box scores, and on the biggest stages. But as the 2003 NFL Draft approached, something strange happened. The conversation shifted. The efficiency was questioned. The resume was dissected. The confidence suddenly felt conditional. Quarterbacks with fewer accolades and worse numbers began climbing draft boards, while Banks, the most efficient quarterback in the country, quietly drifted out of view. And that raises the question no one ever answered. How does a season this clean, this controlled, and this successful still end without a real opportunity? Brad Banks didn't arrive at Iowa with hype, guarantees, or a carefully mapped quarterback path. He arrived as a problem to solve. His journey alone should have eliminated every lazy evaluation that followed him later. Out of high school in Bellglade, Florida, Banks was a winner, state champion, team captain, multi-sport athlete, but not a can't-miss recruit. At Central Florida, he redshirted and learned the mechanics of drop-back passing behind Dante Culpepper, absorbing the position without ever being handed it. Then came the detour that would later be used against him, junior college. At Hines Community College, Banks wasn't even trusted immediately as quarterback. He played wide receiver first. When he finally moved under center, all he did was lead Hines to an 11-1 record, a national ranking as high as number 4, and a junior college championship, producing both through the air and on the ground. Winning followed him, even when opportunity lagged behind. When Iowa finally found him, it was almost by accident. A coach scouting someone else, a tape passed along, a staff that fell in love with what they saw once they actually watched. Even then, Banks didn't walk in as the future. He waited, he learned, and when he finally got his first career start in 2002, everything changed immediately. Iowa didn't simplify the offense, they didn't protect him with gimmicks. They trusted him, and Banks rewarded the trust by becoming something rare. A quarterback who played mistake-free football without playing scared. He wasn't freelancing, he wasn't padding stats. He was running a Big Ten offense with control, discipline, and balance, throwing with timing, extending plays without chaos, and making decisions that didn't show up as highlights but showed up on the scoreboard. In one season, a quarterback who hadn't started a game before transformed Iowa into a national contender. That kind of rise usually creates a clear NFL narrative. Usually, that's where the story accelerates. But for Brad Banks, that's where the pause began. Because once the efficiency appeared, the league started asking the wrong questions. If Brad Banks' season is remembered at all, it's usually summarized the wrong way. As a nice story, a hot year, a feel-good run. But when you slow down and actually look at the numbers, that framing collapses. This wasn't a quarterback piling up empty yards in a loose system. This was efficiency in its purest form, delivered in an era that did quarterbacks no favors. In 2002, defenses were still allowed to dictate games. Passing windows were tighter, hits were legal, completion percentages hovered in the low to mid-50s, and mistakes ended seasons. Against that backdrop, Banks didn't just survive, he separated himself. He completed nearly 58% of his passes, threw for over 2,500 yards, and finished with 26 touchdowns against just 7 interceptions. That ratio wasn't common then, it was elite. Even more telling was how those numbers came. Banks wasn't hiding behind screens or checkdowns. His yards per attempt reflected controlled aggression, pushing the ball downfield without turning it over. He protected possessions, finished drives, and consistently put Iowa in favorable situations. Add in his rushing impact, and you're talking about a quarterback responsible for the overwhelming majority of his team's offensive production, yet almost never putting the ball in danger. That's not flash, that's command. And the accolades followed because voters understood what they were watching. Davey O'Brien Award, AP College Football Player of the Year, Big Ten Offensive Player of the Year, Heisman runner up. Hardware doesn't come from hype, it comes from performance sustained over time. What makes this season uncomfortable in hindsight is how clean it was. There's no statistical flaw to lean on, no reckless stretch, no pattern of bad decisions. The efficiency didn't spike and fade, it held steady as the competition increased, which makes what happened next even harder to explain. Because once draft evaluations began, the same numbers that elevated Banks in college suddenly became questions. And when efficiency stops being an advantage, you have to ask why it was reclassified as a concern. Efficiency can hide in blowouts. It can inflate against overmatched teams. But Brad Banks' defining trait in 2002 was that his efficiency traveled into hostile stadiums, into late game chaos, into moments where quarterbacks either steady a team or sink it. Iowa's season didn't unfold on cruise control. It demanded answers. And every time the pressure shifted, Banks responded with control instead of panic. After the early stumble against Iowa State, the only true blemish, the season pivoted. At Penn State, in one of the toughest environments in conference, Banks didn't unravel when the game tightened. He absorbed momentum swings, recalibrated, and delivered when the moment demanded precision. In overtime, with everything exposed, he threw a touchdown pass that reflected exactly what his season had been about. The right read, the right throw, no wasted motion. A week later against Purdue, the stakes rose again. Down late, no timeouts, 87 yards to go, Banks didn't force anything. He moved the offense calmly, converting pressure into progress until fourth down arrived with the game on the line. The throw to Dallas Clark wasn't reckless or heroic, it was correct. That's the difference. These weren't improvisational miracles masking flaws, they were controlled decisions. By season's end, Iowa wasn't winning because of gimmicks, they were winning because their quarterback didn't beat himself and didn't let moments speed him up. For most prospects, that resume becomes the foundation for patience at the next level. For Banks, it became the part of the evaluation that was strangely minimized, as if thriving in pressure somehow raised doubts instead of eliminating them. By the time the 2003 NFL draft arrived, the logic around Brad Banks should have been simple: award-winning quarterback, elite efficiency, big game composure, conference champion. But instead of momentum, Banks ran into a wall of hesitation. And that's where the comparison becomes unavoidable. In that same draft year, quarterbacks with less hardware, shakier efficiency, and far more visible flaws were given real opportunities to develop. Seneca Wallace became the symbol of that divide. Wallace was electric, dynamic, and undeniably talented, but statistically, his profile was far less controlled. His college career featured more interceptions, lower passing efficiency, and fewer moments where the offense was calmly managed start to finish. And yet, Wallace was drafted, invested in, and given time to adjust. He was allowed to struggle, he was allowed to learn. Banks was not. This wasn't about one quarterback being better than the other, it was about opportunity. Draft rooms didn't ask whether Banks' efficiency translated, they quietly decided it didn't deserve to be tested. The same league that preached patience with raw tools suddenly had none for a quarterback whose resume screamed readiness. And that contrast went deeper than Wallace. Other quarterbacks in the class with fewer accolades and less consistent production still received something Banks never did: a developmental runway. Training camp reps, preseason starts, the benefit of mistakes. Banks signed after the draft, but he wasn't evaluated like a prospect. He was treated like a question mark already answered. The gap wasn't talent, it was production, it was trust. And once that trust was withheld, the door closed fast. Because in the NFL, efficiency only matters if teams are willing to believe it came from the right kind of quarterback. Once Brad Banks entered the NFL evaluation pipeline, the language around him quietly shifted. The same traits that were praised on Saturdays were suddenly reframed on Sundays. Efficient became system. Poised became protected. Mobile became uncertain. The conversation wasn't about what he did, it was about how he looked doing it. Iowa's offense, which demanded timing, progressions, and decision making, was reduced to a label that stripped Banks of agency. Never mind that he consistently worked the tight end into his passing game, often as a secondary or third read. Never mind that he threw effectively on bootlegs, play action, and traditional dropbacks. The efficiency was real, but it didn't fit a narrow visual template scouts were comfortable with. Banks didn't win in a way that looked familiar to them, and that mattered more than the results. His mobility, which had been an asset in college, was treated as a risk instead of a tool. His calm under pressure was interpreted as passivity. His lack of turnovers was questioned rather than trusted. Instead of asking how to build around a quarterback who protected the football and elevated his team, the league asked whether he could be reshaped into something else. And when a quarterback enters the league already framed as a conversion project, the evaluation is over before it begins. Banks wasn't given the space to grow because teams decided growth wasn't the issue, belief was. The irony is that everything the NFL later celebrated in modern quarterbacks efficiency, composure, mobility, decision making was already present. It just arrived before the league was willing to recognize it in that form. And once that judgment was made, no amount of production could reopen the conversation. When Brad Banks' name went uncalled in the 2003 NFL Draft, the verdict felt final, not because he had failed, but because the league had already moved on. He signed briefly after the draft, but without the commitment that turns prospects into projects. There were no extended evaluations, no developmental reps, no margin for learning. The efficiency that defined his college career wasn't tested, it was dismissed. So Banks did what players with unresolved talent often do. He kept playing. In the CFL, he continued to produce, earning opportunities with multiple teams and proving that his skill set traveled beyond college football. In arena football, where decision making is exposed on every snap, he delivered one of the most explosive single game performances the league had ever seen, throwing for 10 touchdowns and adding another on the ground. The arm was still there, the composure was still there, the efficiency followed him just as it always had. What never followed was patience from the NFL. And that's the part that lingers. Brad Banks didn't flame out, he wasn't overmatched, he wasn't figured out. His career was redirected because the league chose not to invest in what he already was. His story isn't about a quarterback who failed to adapt, it's about a league that never allowed adaptation to begin. And when you look back at the efficiency, the awards, the composure, and the comparisons from his draft class, the question becomes harder to avoid. If quarterbacks with worse numbers were given time, why wasn't Brad Banks ever given a chance? Brad Banks' story isn't loud. There was no public failure, no infamous moment to point to, no single play that explains why it ended the way it did. That's what makes it uncomfortable. The numbers were clean, the efficiency was real, the poise showed up when it mattered most. And yet, when the transition came, the opportunity never did. His career forces a harder conversation, not about talent, but about trust, and about which quarterbacks were allowed to learn on the job and which ones were expected to be finished products before they ever took a snap. Brad Banks did everything the game asked of him. He won, he protected the football, he delivered in big moments. What he never received was the one thing that defines NFL success more than any stat: patience. And sometimes the greatest what ifs aren't about missed throws, they're about chances that leave a comment and subscribe to Old School Sundays. We dig into numbers, the context, and the moments the history books rush past. New episodes every week because some careers deserve a second look.